The wind whistled through the hills, carrying the smell of blood and burning wood. Flames danced on the horizon, reflected in the empty eyes of the dead. Ravens cawed, fighting over the flesh of the fallen. And in the center of the slaughter, one man still breathed. Eric the Great Bear stood, leaning on the handle of his axe, his muscles throbbing with exhaustion. His black wool fur was soaked with sweat and blood, his shaggy beard plastered to his face by still weeping wounds. Behind him, what had once been his village lay in ruins, a scattering of bodies scattered amid the flames, the wreckage of huts reduced to embers. His clan was dead, his battle brothers, his family, all turned to dust and ash. Ahead of him, the banner of a Saxon king flapped proudly in the wind. The enemy army surrounded him like a hungry pack, swords stained red, spears pointed at his chest. But Eric would not kneel. He would not beg. He did not know the language of surrender. His ancestors watched him from the golden halls of Valhalla, and he would not give them the grief of falling like a lamb. The Saxon general dismounted from his horse, a tall man with wheat-colored hair and war-scarred eyes. His armor gleamed in the firelight, and there was a weight in his gaze, a mixture of respect and pity. "You fought like a demon," the Saxon said, his voice thick with weariness. "Surrender, warrior. I will give you a dignified end." Eric felt a laugh rise in his chest, a hoarse, fierce sound. He spat blood onto the ground. "You speak of dignity as if you knew it." His voice sounded like distant thunder before a storm. "I am the bear. I am the storm. I am the thunder you will fear on moonless nights." Silence fell like a sharp blade. The general frowned in confusion. Then Eric stepped forward. With a roar that made the gods themselves tremble, he raised his axe and hurled himself at them. And that night, beneath the ashes of his village, a legend began to be forged. The icy wind howled through the tall pines of the north when Eric was born. Born in the village of Skardheim, where winters punished even the strongest, his mother used to say that he did not cry at birth. He simply opened his eyes and faced the world, as if defying the gods from the moment he took his first breath. His father, Bjorn Steeltooth, was a legendary warrior who had fought alongside kings and jarls, a man whose strength was compared to that of an enraged bear. Perhaps it was fate, perhaps it was blood. But Eric would inherit not only his father's fury, but his indomitable spirit. From an early age, fighting and survival shaped his character. After only 8 winters, he was already hunting alone in the forest, facing wolves and the biting cold that killed grown men. While other boys trained with wooden swords, Eric wielded a real axe, a gift from his father. At 12, he killed a giant boar with a single blow to the skull. It was on that day that his people began to call him the Bear, for they said his strength was not human, but something that came from the beasts of the forest. But Eric did not want to be just strong. He wanted to be a warrior worthy of the halls of Valhalla. His true test came when his village was attacked by a rival clan. At just 15 years old, he picked up the shield of a fallen man and fought alongside the warriors, cutting down 3 of his enemies before the battle was over. When the bodies were counted, they found that he had killed more men than many veterans. His father looked at him that night and, for the first time, no longer treated him like a boy. The years passed, and Eric became a feared and respected warrior. His name was whispered by his enemies and shouted in song by skalds who witnessed his exploits. He sailed the icy seas, sacked Saxon strongholds, and fought Franks and Slavs. But he was not just a bloodthirsty butcher. Eric chose his battle shrewdly, and his leadership was admired by those who followed him. Unlike many warriors who sought only gold and momentary glory, he wanted something more. He wanted his name to echo through the ages. One of his most legendary exploits occurred at the fortress of Dunholm, where a Saxon army was entrenched. Eric and a small band of warriors crept in at night, scaling the walls in the storm. As the sentries were dispatched in the silence of darkness, Eric led a fierce attack, opening the gates for his clan to invade. That night, Dunholm fell, and Eric's name was etched into the memories of the survivors like a living nightmare. But his legend was not all about victories. He also faced betrayal, lost friends in battle, and knew the weight of responsibility. When his Jarl fell in battle, many expected Eric to take command, but he refused. He said it was not yet his time, that the gods still tested him. This gesture of humility, rare among warriors, only made him more respected. The title of Great Bear was not given lightly. One winter, his clan faced an unexpected threat. A Saxon king was marching with a large army to destroy their settlements. With no time for reinforcements, Eric decided on the unthinkable. He and 30 warriors would ambush a contingent of 100 Saxon soldiers to cut off their vanguard. The battle was brutal. Eric fought like a storm, his axe cutting down lives as if the gods themselves guided his blade. The panicked Saxon said he was not a man, but a monster who could not be killed. Even when he was wounded, he kept fighting, roaring like a wounded bear that refuses to fall. When the last Saxon fell, Eric was covered in blood, but standing. From that day on, he was not just the bear. He was the Great Bear. The skalds sang of his fury, of how his enemies trembled at the sound of his name. But Eric knew that fate had greater challenges in store for him. Something inside him whispered that his greatest battle was yet to come. And as the flames consumed his village and his enemies surrounded him, he felt no fear, only a burning desire to make his name echo through the ages. The Great Bear still roared, and his legend was far from over. The bitter north wind roared through the fjords, hissing through the trees as if the gods themselves were whispering ancient secrets. The village of Skardheim lay between towering mountains and a deep fjord that reflected the pale glow of the stars. It was not the largest Viking village, nor the richest, but its history was woven with iron, courage, and the blood of countless warriors. Those who dared to set foot on its lands found no docile people or willing to negotiate. Skardheim was a stronghold of warriors, men and women shaped by the brutality of the world around them. Every house, every reinforced log wall, every shield hanging over the great doors of the main hall was a reminder that the Bears of the North, as they were called, never retreated. The sagas told how the first inhabitants of Skardheim were not guided by chance, but by an ancient spirit, a huge white bear, who led them to these lands and fought alongside them against rival tribes who sought to claim the territory. When the final battle was over, the bear succumbed to its wounds and, according to legend, its spirit merged with the soil and the mountains, becoming the eternal protector of the village. For this reason, the bear was the sacred symbol of Skardheim. Young warriors, upon coming of age, had to set out into the frozen mountains and hunt a bear to prove their worth, not only to show their strength, but to connect with the spirit of the village, to become part of its living legend. That is how Eric got his name. Unlike other young men who simply killed the beast and returned with its skin as a trophy, Eric did something unexpected. He tracked a gigantic bear for days, braving the bitter cold and hunger, until he finally found the creature. The animal, wounded and cornered, roared at him, ready to fight to its last breath. But Eric did not draw his sword. He let the beast attack him, testing his strength against the animal's. The fight was brutal. For long minutes, man and beast faced each other, not as enemies, but as equals. Eric did not retreat, did not cry out for help. He gave in to his instincts, absorbed the creature's fury, until, exhausted and bleeding, he fell beside the bear. And it was then that something happened. The animal, instead of attacking him again, simply looked into his eyes, as if recognizing in him something greater than a simple warrior. Eric did not kill it. Instead, he retreated from the mountain, bearing the scars of the fight as his true mark of conquest. From then on, they called him the Great Bear, for it was said that he had become one with the spirit of the village. And for years, he was its fiercest protector. Skardheim was much more than a fortified settlement. It was a strategic pillar of the Nordic lands. Because of its location, between the great fjords and the mountains, the village dominated a crucial passage for traders, explorers, and raiders. Merchant ships came from all over to trade in furs, precious metals, and weapons forged by the legendary blacksmiths of Skardheim. In addition, the village had one of the finest warrior forces in Scandinavia. They did not have the numbers of great kingdoms, but every man and woman who held a sword was trained from childhood to fight as if their life depended on it. Because, indeed, it did. Their fighters were not mere soldiers. They were hunters, navigators, strategists, and many of them had crossed the northern sea to plunder distant lands. Warriors from Skardheim fought alongside powerful jarls, their names echoing across the battlefields. And that was precisely what attracted the attention of the Saxons. Across the sea, in the Saxon lands, the Christian kings were beginning to worry. For years, they had watched their monasteries pillaged, their villages burned, their riches carried off by northern warriors who appeared like violent storms and disappeared before they could retaliate. But the Saxons were no fools. They began to study their enemies. They mapped their settlements, captured spies, interrogated prisoners, and in every story they heard, one name kept coming back: Skardheim. The spies spoke of an impenetrable village, of warriors who knew no fear, of a leader whose name was whispered with respect and awe, Eric the Great Bear. The Saxons knew that if they were to break the Vikings' power, they had to destroy their foundation. And what better way to do that than to annihilate their strongest people? And so a Saxon king sent his armies north. But no ordinary fleet. He gathered the best warriors of his lands, veteran generals and commanders experienced in the art of war. They would not come just to pillage. They would come to exterminate. Unbeknownst to Eric and his people, death was already crossing the sea. Saxon ships sailed under the cover of night, and razor-sharp warriors eager for combat. The plan was not just to attack, but to surround the village, destroy its supplies, and ensure that no survivors escaped. Skardheim was about to face the greatest challenge in its history, and when the battle came, it would be Eric the Great Bear who would decide the fate of his people. The north was wild, where the wind cut like sharp blades and the land rose, defying the heavens with its mountains and dark forests. But in the south, the land was fertile, with green fields and dense forests that fed the Saxon people. There, in the kingdom of Wessex, among the winding rivers and rolling hills, Aldric, the future king, was born, and with him, the weight of a destiny forged by ambition and war. Aldric was the son of King Edred, a leader revered by his subjects and feared by the neighboring peoples. When Aldric was just a child, his father taught him from an early age the secrets of the sword and strategy, educating him not only to rule, but to conquer. It was not brute strength alone that would make him king, but the ability to maneuver between alliances and betrayals, to negotiate and, when necessary, to crush his enemies without mercy. From his youth, Aldric distinguished himself not only by the strength of his arm, but by the coldness of his heart. His gaze, always penetrating and calculating, never wavered from his objectives, and his strategic mind always sought an advantage, a weak point to exploit. He grew up under the sign of war, like a wolf among sheep, always ready to attack before being attacked. When he was still young, his father sent him to the battlefields, not to fight, but to observe, learn, and understand the forces that governed the kingdom of Wessex. It was during one of these expeditions that Aldrich faced one of the greatest challenges of his youth. A Viking clan led by an imposing and ruthless chieftain had invaded his lands. The battle that followed was bloody, with the Saxons being forced to retreat. When the Viking chieftain, a wild-eyed, iron-bearded man, captured one of his generals, Aldrich saw something in his eyes that he would never forget: a disdain for life, a boldness without limits. But what impressed him most was the Vikings' strategy, their ability to strike quickly, like storms that arise without warning. After their defeat, Aldrich retreated to reflect. He knew that while his army was large, it lacked the same ferocity, the same cunning that the Vikings possessed. And in that moment, he vowed that Wessex would never again be caught off guard. He would begin his own rise to power, seeking not only to expand his territory, but to destroy any threat that stood before him, starting with the Vikings. Little by little, Aldrich earned the respect and loyalty of his vassals, using his cunning to manipulate alliances and subdue those who dared challenge him. His reign, however, was not based solely on military victories. He knew that a king needed more than an army. He needed resources, and Aldrich was a master at exploiting every available resource. He invested heavily in his fleet, in stores of food, in precious metals to forge weapons of war and impenetrable armor. But Aldrich's power did not come solely from his military might. His control over the land of Wessex was absolute. His iron and copper mines were some of the richest in the kingdom, and he had forged alliances with merchants from far-flung lands to ensure that his wealth would never be questioned. He used his assets as tools of subordination, buying loyalties with silver and threatening with the blade. His influence over the church was also key to solidifying his position, creating a network of information and alliances that transcended the boundaries of secular politics. However, his greatest of all victories was the unification of the Saxon kingdoms under his rule. Aldrich was not just the king of Wessex. He had become the monarch of all England, forging an empire with blood and iron. His skill at conquest was not limited to the battlefield, but extended to the manipulation of men's minds. To his enemies, Aldrich was a nightmare, a shifting shadow, ever seeking more power. But there was one thing he could not control: the people of the north. Skardheim, with its impenetrable village and legendary warriors, had become a constant threat. Aldrich's spies had brought back tales of how the name of Eric the Great Bear resounded on the northern winds, a living legend that inspired his own warriors. Aldrich had heard the tales of the Viking leader who defied all his enemies with an almost supernatural ferocity. He had known, somewhere along the way, that this man, this bear, needed to be destroyed, not only to secure peace in England, but to prove his own superiority. The strategically minded Saxon king knew that Skardheim was more than a small village in the middle of a distant land. These people, with their fighting skills like beasts, had the power to shift the balance of power in northern Europe. The news of their victories, the fame of their warriors, and the uncompromising nature of their culture alarmed him deeply. If he allowed the Vikings to prosper, it could mean the ruin of his empire. Aldrich did not fear the men of Skardheim, but he did fear the symbolism that Eric represented: brute strength and indomitable resistance, qualities that could incite other peoples to rise up against his rule. The mission was clear: destroy Skardheim, eradicate Eric's line, break the spirit of resistance of the Viking people, and show the rest of the world that no clan, no man, could defy the will of the Saxon king. He gathered his generals, formed a coalition of mercenaries and loyal soldiers, and prepared his armies. This would be no mere raid, but a campaign to subdue the heart of Viking resistance once and for all. His motive was not merely to conquer a village, but to extinguish the flames of revolt in the north once and for all. The impact of this war would be profound, a message to any who would consider challenging his rule. Now, as the Saxon armies marched north, Aldrich knew that the fight for Skardheim would be not just a war of land and men, but a war of ideals, of clashing civilizations. For him, what was at stake was the eternity of his empire. And in the end, only one king could stand. The dawn of the day was bloody. The sky, normally clear and clear, was now covered in heavy clouds, as if the universe itself were preparing for the massacre that was about to happen. The land, soaked by the rain of the previous night, was a perfect field for the Saxon soldiers to march with their heavy shields and iron boots. The sound of the horses' hooves and the murmurs of the men formed an ominous chorus as the great army advanced through the dense forests that surrounded Skardheim. The village, isolated, tranquil in its Viking spirit, was still silent when the first signs of smoke appeared on the horizon. For the inhabitants of Skardheim, the warning that something dark was coming was immediate. The sentries in the watchtower spotted the first Saxon scouts, light horsemen, who crossed the distant fields before disappearing into the mist. The sight of the horsemen was followed by an explosion of shouts, the sound of war. The sound the Vikings knew like their own blood pounding in their veins. Eric the Great Bear heard the screams. He knew this was not just an attack, it was an invasion. The battle began at first light. The Saxon forces, a wall of shields and spears, approached the walls of Skardheim, their numbers overwhelming. The terrain around the village was prepared, with trenches and hidden traps, created by years of war and experience. But nothing could prepare the Vikings for the immense army that Aldrich, the Saxon king, had assembled. Eric stood at the front lines, his presence imposing like a storm about to break. He led his people, his clan, with the strength of 1,000 men. He knew that this day, the fight would be uneven, but none of it mattered. His warriors were ready. There was no choice. The battle would be for survival or for eternal honor in the halls of Valhalla. The battle exploded with the fury of the gods. The Saxons advanced like a wave of iron, their swords and axes gleaming in the rising sunlight. The Vikings responded with the roar of war, the sound of axes clashing against shields, and the screams of fury that echoed through the village. It was a brutal, merciless clash. Every blow was fatal, and with each advance of the Saxons, the warriors of Skardheim fell back to their defenses, trying to repel the relentless wave of enemies. Eric fought with the strength of a god. His axe, an extension of his own body, cut through his enemies with deadly precision. He was everywhere, his roar echoing across the field, drawing the Saxons like bees to a hive. His every move was a lesson in Viking fury. He cut down knights, cut through ranks of soldiers, and cut through shields as if they were May paper. But the numbers were overwhelming. For every Saxon soldier who fell, 5 rose to take his place. The men of Skardheim, though fierce, were being thinned by the vast enemy army. With every passing minute, more Vikings fell, their spears breaking on impact, their swords shattering. The smell of blood and iron filled the air, and the sound of battle grew deafening. At the center of it all, Eric the Great Bear continued the fight with indescribable fury. His black wool fur was now soaked in blood, not his own, but the blood of his enemies, and that of his own battle brothers who fell all around him. The ground was strewn with bodies, both Saxon and Viking, a terrifying vision of endless war. But the pressure was too much. At one point, when the weight of the enemy seemed unbearable, a treacherous blow struck Eric's side. He faltered, a sword thrust slashing his flesh. An intense pain staggered him. Still, he stood firm. His eyes still burned with the fury of thunder. But his resistance was coming to an end. The Saxons were surrounding him, closing in with ruthless precision. It was then that the Saxon general approached Eric, dismounting from his horse with a look of respect mixed with pity. His voice was low, but thick with weariness. You fought like a demon, he said, the weight of his words evident in the way the Saxons stopped to watch. Surrender, warrior. I will give you a worthy end. Those watching knew that Eric's moment had come, but his response was like thunder, a roar of unshakable pride. Eric the Great Bear stood, leaning on the handle of his axe, his muscles throbbing with exhaustion. His black wool fur was soaked with sweat and blood, his shaggy beard plastered to his face from still oozing wounds. Behind him, what had once been his village lay in ruins, a scattering of bodies in the flames, the wreckage of huts reduced to embers. His clan was dead, his battle brothers, his family, all turned to dust and ash. Before him, the banner of a Saxon king fluttered proudly in the wind. The enemy army surrounded him like a hungry pack, swords stained red, spears pointed at his chest. But Eric would not kneel. He would not beg. He did not know the language of surrender. His ancestors washed him from the golden halls of Valhalla, and he would not give them the grief of falling like a lamb. The Saxon general dismounted from his horse, a tall man with wheat-colored hair and war-scarred eyes. His armor gleamed in the firelight, and there was a heaviness in his gaze, a mixture of respect and pity. You fought like a demon, the Saxon said, his voice thick with weariness. Surrender, warrior. I will give you a worthy end. Eric felt a laugh rise in his chest, a hoarse, fierce sound. He spat blood onto the ground. You speak of dignity as if you know it. His voice sounded like the distant thunder before the storm. I am the bear. I am the storm. I am the thunder you will fear on moonless nights. Silence fell like a sharp blade. The general frowned in confusion. Then Eric stepped forward. With a roar that made the gods themselves tremble, he raised his axe and charged at them. Viking fury, a final burst of rage, flashed across the battlefield. Eric cut and killed. Blood gushed. Bodies fell at the feet of the great warrior. But there were too many. Finally, exhausted and surrounded, Eric the Great Bear fell. His last sight was the Saxon king's banner, the curse of his people now fulfilled. Skardheim had fallen. The clan was destroyed. The legend of Eric the Great Bear, however, did not die with the battle. It was engraved in the hearts of the few survivors, who would carry their story forward, singing it in the halls of Valhalla. The roar of the bear, the thunder of Skardheim, would never be forgotten. The Saxons had won the war, but they knew they had faced an enemy like no other. A Saxon king might conquer lands, but he could never destroy the legend that was born on that battlefield. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.